Welcome back, everybody. Today's episode is going to be all about the history of nachos.
Wait, no. It's history nachos.
Nachos taste good anyway.
Roll the intro footage.
Hey, that's my line.
Welcome to History Nachos. We do things a little differently. Names and dates take a back seat to humanity's greatest real stories. So sit back and enjoy the ride.
Welcome back to the channel, Patriot Nation. Today I have a special guest with me, my friend Luke Wagner. Luke, welcome to the channel.
Thanks, glad to be here.
So Luke is a founder and host of a podcast and YouTube channel called History Nachos. Luke, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I decided to start a podcast because I've always been into history. It's where a lot of my academic credentials are. But I also noticed when I was going through school, there's so much that isn't covered in your history classes. So I decided I want to make a podcast that covers a lot of those things that are in the gaps. Like there's a woman called Sorgatani, who's the most powerful woman to ever live. Most people have never heard of her. But she controlled an empire that stretched from the coast of China to Poland. She was Kublai Khan's mom, and the reason why he was in power. I actually did an episode on her, so you can check that out on my channel. We'll make sure to put a link below.
Definitely will. So, appreciate you sharing that. History Nachos, what's the whole deal with picking the name History Nachos for your podcast and channel?
Well, I'm originally from Southern California, and out there we eat a lot of nachos because I grew up about 60 miles from the Mexican border. Oh yeah, they're wonderful.
Yeah.
So, the thing about nachos is you can have them as a whole meal on their own, especially if you load them up with all kinds of good stuff.
Oh yeah.
Or you can use them as an appetizer before you go into your main meal. So I decided to take that approach with my podcast. I give an overview of events that people can watch and listen to and understand what happened. But if they get more into the story and really want to get into the details, I also give that option. So I'll give resources at the end of my episode and on my social media. So for example, if that Sorgatani person I was talking about, there are all kinds of primary sources. There's a book called The Secret History of the Mongols, which is actually the royal family's story from Mongolia. And that's where a lot of her story comes from. And there are also historians from the Muslim world at that time who knew about her. And I put links to some of those in there.
Definitely worth checking out. How do you say that name again?
Sorgatani.
Sorgatani?
That's right. Yeah, it's a difficult name. It took me a while.
Difficult name. So being that you're from California, I'm really interested to know why you chose Texas. What was so attractive about Texas and leading California to come to Texas?
Short version, freedom. Because out in California, even before all the COVID stuff was going on, there was more and more state encroachment on individual liberties going on to a level that really just wasn't acceptable for me as an American.
Oh yeah.
So
gun laws.
Absolutely, I had to modify my AR-15 to where. And by the way, in my area, I'm from Orange County. There are actually engineers who created ways to get around the California gun laws on technicalities. Because there used to be a thing called a bullet button, where you'd have to kind of punch in with a screwdriver.
Yes.
You know what
Terrible,
I'm talking about. Well, California outlawed those because they wanted to outlaw AR-15s. So people in my neck of the woods came up with a different system where, because what California says, you need to split open your AR by taking out that detent pin. So in California, they actually came up with a new rear detent pin that only splits it a little bit just like that and has a little arm on your mag release that goes into the gap. So you just go like that and you press your rear detent pin, it just goes like that and you can reload just like normal.
Ingenuity at its finest. So coming to California to Texas, freedom is a big theme I'm hearing from you. What about history in general? Like I remember you mentioned before we were doing this interview that some of the things that you research is actually used in the curriculum of schools, for instance.
Yes.
Which is so important, guys, because they're trying to mold minds of our children to fit an agenda that we don't agree with. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, first of all, with my podcast, I always make sure the content is clean enough to be used in schools. I don't swear, and I go into things like wars and romantic relationships, if you get my drift, but I always allude to them, kind of like what I just did there.
Right.
So it can be used in schools. I actually reached out to one of my old high school history teachers, and she loved the podcast. So
Awesome.
now she uses it as part of her curriculum.
Right on, man. That's a big bravo to that. A guy standing up for real research and real truth, and then implement it in a fashion like that. So, guys, if you're into history and you're a history buff, and maybe you're not, maybe you're just interested in Luke himself, go and give him a follow on his podcast, and definitely a subscribe on his YouTube channel. And Luke, I know there's a couple other options for people out there. You want to talk about that?
Yes, of course. I also have a BitChute channel, which for those of you who haven't heard of BitChute, it's a free speech alternative to YouTube. So YouTube does a certain degree of censorship, but BitChute does not. Their policy is any legal speech, because there are certain legal restrictions on what can be in public discourse. I studied that a lot in law school. So anything that you could say out in the public square is something you can put on BitChute.
So great information about BitChute. Definitely check them out. Is there anything else out there? I think you mentioned Gab.
Yes, there's a website called Gab where it's an alternative to Facebook and Twitter. It's, again, that free speech alternative where all legal speech is allowed. So what they do is they allow you to put things on there, just like Facebook and Twitter do. So I decided to use it for bonus content for my podcast.
Awesome.
So, if, for example, a lot of the books I use for my sources have digital versions, or I can find links where you can buy them. I'll post those on there. But I also do visuals. You know, for example, when I did an episode on how Cuba turned from a free country to communism, I did a bunch of photos from Cuba in the 20s and the 50s and during the revolution, and all kinds of stories related to that people could read about and get into.
Yeah, I have listened to the episode on Cuba that you did. Great information, and the music is awesome, by the way, for those of you who love Latin music.
Yeah, all the songs on that episode are actually from artists who lived in Cuba while it was free.
Yeah, Cuba wasn't always oppressed. They were a free nation at one point, so good information there. So guys, if you're into history and you're into truth when it comes to history, definitely check out History Nachos podcast and YouTube channel. We appreciate you coming on the channel, sir. Thank you for your service and bringing truth to us. And until next time, train smart, be safe, and stay prayed up. This is Still Shot and
History Nachos.
signing out.